start. Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. Alhamdulillah. So this is Maqasid Institute's research forum, and this is session 2. And Alhamdulillah, we have our brother Dr. Baptiste Brodard with us. And inshallah, he'll be presenting his research, his ideas, and on the topic that I will just state in a minute. And just to remind, I see that many of you here who are joining the part of our Maqasid methodology course, and I think some of you are also probably our students at IKI. Or past or former students rather. So Alhamdulillah, and many of you are interested in research. You are already doing research in some way, and this platform that we created is specifically for sharing the research from the Maqasid perspective. And so all the younger scholars or junior and senior scholars are welcome to present their papers. And then this platform is here for us to learn about this methodology and also share how can we apply it in real life research. And so here we have Dr. Baptiste Brodard. And okay, you sent me something. Okay, just a minute. And so Dr. Baptiste, he is a Swiss national. He has obtained his Ph.D. in social sciences and religious studies in 2020 at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. And he completed his postdoctoral research at the Universidad Veracruzana in Mexico. And he studied the Islamic Muslim communities in Colombia and Mexico, focusing on transnational Islamic movements and their involvement in spreading and teaching Islam in non-Muslim countries. And he's currently the assistant professor in sociology at the International Islamic University Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur. And one of his interests is in the evolution of contemporary Islamic thought, as well as Islamic activism in society, particularly in the area of social work, advocacy, and humanitarian aid. And in today's talk, he will present his research on spirituality in social work, why and how the needs for faith and quest for meaning should be addressed in counseling. So this is the topic for today, and let me just remind what what is the housekeeping, so-called. If you have any questions, the questions and the question and answer session will be after the presentation, which will be about up to 45 minutes, inshallah. And then we'll have our discussion. So. Please, I mean, you all the participants, please think of questions. Think of ask him how he did his research, and try to get more, pick his brain into more how he used the Maqasid methodology. And so let's now, without further ado, please to Dr. Baptiste Brodard, and we start the count for his 45 minutes, inshallah.
الله جزاك الله خير دكتور. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وبارك وسلم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. Good afternoon, good morning. I'm happy to be back with you at the Maqasid Institute. It has been a while, but we still try to work on our respective projects in the meantime. And today, I would like to speak about this topic about how we can bring back spirituality and religion to social work, to counseling. So I'll speak about that in a broad way, voluntarily. I mean, I could speak about Islamic perspective on social work, or just Islamic approach to counseling, whatever it is. But I think that after reflection, I wanted to take the problem from another perspective, from another beginning, let's say. And it's part of communication with broader society than Muslims. And I think we'll discuss these points further in my presentation. What I mean here is that as we are all Muslims, so most of us are Muslims, we can speak about it in a very traditional way, because we know we share the same assumption. But at the same time, I think we have to share the concern for the broader community, meaning the human beings, even if they don't share the belief. That's why I would like to explore this topic in a bit different perspective than what I did 2 years ago, maybe last year. I used to speak about that previously in another presentation. And today the scope will be a bit different. But with the conclusion, we can explore more details with the Maqasid approach and methodological concern. But before doing that, I would like voluntarily again to broaden the scope, to widen scope, in order to make sure to find other perspectives, to think about the topic, but also to communicate with a broader audience, not only Muslims, but also non-Muslims. So please let me share my slides to make it easier for this presentation to be clearer. I won't go back to the title, but because Dr. Elders already mentioned it. But let me present the content. I propose 5 parts. I have about 40 minutes now, maximum, to try to develop these following points. And all are interconnected, of course, but it gives an idea of the content of today's presentation. First, I would like to start with preliminary observations, not from an Islamic perspective, but from so-called sociological perspective, empirical perspective. What happens today outside? What happens in the field of social work, in counseling? I think that's very important to begin with that in today's presentation. And before I start with this point, I would like to remind you that I did previous research about connected topics. My PhD was about so-called Islamic social work, or if we want, how Muslim organizations undertake welfare activities in Europe, in the UK, in Switzerland, in France, meaning how the mosques help the poor, how Muslim associations try to bring added values in order to tackle social issues. That was my research in the field of sociology and religious studies, but it was mostly based on empirical case studies, not on theological reflection. That's important to note. So that allowed me at that time to understand what's going on concretely in the name of Islam, how these Muslim organizations proceed with this intention of providing welfare services, what they do concretely. Then in my postdoctoral research, it was another topic. It was about the autochthonous Muslim communities in Colombia and Mexico. So it's totally different scope, but something was interesting to note here is that I could appreciate how the entry of Islam, how the conversions to Islam changed people's life at that time in this context. So that was one of the edit video of this postdoctoral research, because in both studies, if you want, my concern or my purpose is to think about social change, is to think about change and how Islam helps people and communities to change. That's my concern. When I speak about change, I speak about specific people suffering, specific people or communities being affected by social, psychological issues and how they can change. Because it's not easy to get out of trouble. It's not easy to be healed of many ailments. And we'll speak about that a bit later. But also I want to add that I was social worker before of these research periods, meaning that before going back to the university, I worked as a counselor and social worker in prisons. It was very important for me to work in the field concretely to understand people's problem and now to think about what could be done to help people to free themselves from many addictions, from many problems. And that's the scope and focus of today's presentation. But what I want to say here is two things, maybe, just to make it clear. First, I'll speak a lot from a Western perspective, not from so-called Islamic societies, which is important. Because if you imagine to be in an Islamic society, it's easy for you to bring a so-called Islamic project or to build Islamic organization and people will let you work. But if you live in a non-Muslim majority country and you want to develop projects in the name of Islam, you have to consider people's attitude towards you, people's thoughts, people's questions. So this is about the perspective of non-Muslim majority countries, but which also apply to some of the Muslim majority countries. Because even if you go tomorrow to Morocco, for instance, or if you go to Mali or I don't know, to parts of Thailand, south of Thailand, and you propose an Islamic project, at the university you will have the same problem. You will have a lot of people telling you that why should you talk about religion, why you should put the label Islamic in the project, whereas you deal with people who don't want to listen about religion, for instance. So that's a Western perspective, but let's don't forget that the Western epistemologies and the Western influence has been globalized so far, and what happens in the West also contaminated so far many countries in this matter of religion and spirituality. After this, I'll speak about the crisis of civilization, confusion of morals quite quickly, to speak about the need of developing a new methodology of social work. And I will come to the idea of integrating spirituality in social work and counseling. First, I begin with the general idea of religion and spiritualities, and then I will speak more specifically about Islamic model of social work, or Islam. So that's my way to deal with this. This intent is to start with a broader scope and then to finish with the more concrete Islamic model of social work. But I would like to say that I haven't developed it yet so far, but it's on progress, and I think we need each other contribution or reflection. That's what, as usual, I expect the discussion and the questions to be more interesting than my own presentation, inshallah. So, preliminary observations. Social work has been developed for many decades in many countries, but we can see something actually in society today. We can see that social work faces a crisis. It faces a crisis because a lot of people feel within social work environments that it doesn't really work. They feel that so many psychological and social problems affect people. Many people are suffering, and the institutional responses often fail to provide a sustainable, efficient solution to the suffering. So concretely, if you speak about Europe, for instance, Western Europe countries, you have millions of dollars which have been dedicated to social work projects from the state or from private organizations as well. For instance, in the field of reintegration of detainees, ex-prisoners, you have programs in prisons. So the purpose of the program is that the people get away from crime and they reintegrate society with becoming good citizens. That's the plan. But actually, often, most of the time, it doesn't really work. And even when someone gets success in his life, he was in prison, then he got back to society, he feels better. Can we say that it's because of social work? Often we can say it's because of social work project. It can be his own life, its own decisions. So also when we speak about drug addictions, and you have the shelters, you have specific units in hospitals to help people to get out from drug addiction. Often you see a failure of these programs, a failure because people are customers, they are beneficiaries of social projects, but they will tell you that finally it didn't work for them. It's not so relevant. And that's a bit of taboo to say that. I say this because I worked many years, not many years, but less than 10 years, but it's something. I worked less than 10 years in social work institutions, also humanitarian aid organizations, and often you see that what's the impact, what you do. And I want to make it quantitative. I want to keep it qualitative. It deals with human dignity. It deals with humans. And when you see the suffering of them, and you see that despite of the project, the suffering is still here, and you don't feel you have any impact on these people, it's a problem that drives a lot of questions. Because so much money, so many means are given to these projects, but actually we could even say that social work or social welfare activities in these specific fields of prison and drug addiction remain ineffective in most cases, which is obvious problems. Then if we want to understand why it doesn't work, it's interesting to deepen the topic, why it doesn't work. So many people are qualified, they get a master's degree, they work as a psychologist, social worker, they try to help, and they feel something is wrong in my work. We are stuck in the same status quo, and we cannot help people to change. What's important to note first is that most social and psychological aid services are based on the materialistic vision of the human being. That's the premise, that's the assumption. The assumption is that humans are deprived from a spiritual nature. So mostly they would completely ignore the idea of spirituality, the idea of the soul, the concept of God, the concept of strong transcendental reality, or even meaning of life. Because if you ask today's workers, what's the meaning of life? Most people are confused talking about meaning of life, what we live for. So suffering is here, but the reason of suffering is not clear. Because for many, the meaning of life would be to have a good time, to have a pleasure, to have good relations. But if you try to deepen the problem, what's the meaning of life, what we suffer, what we live for, that's kind of questions nobody wants to think about and nobody wants to address in these specific fields. Then the underlying belief system then often ignore spiritual dimension, but it also promotes a materialistic view on the world, which goes hand in hand, actually. But when you talk to the customers, in brackets, of course, the beneficiary recipients, whatever we call them, when you talk to the people you meet in social work, you'll find that they are very interesting in the meaning of life. They are very interesting in thinking about why they suffer, what they can do, what they live for. Or even what after death? What about God? You know, that's kind of questions you will hear a lot, especially with people who suffer a lot in their life, who are facing extreme suffering that make them, that force them to think about these questions. So we feel there's a need to find a meaning in life when talking with recipients, and a lot of them would like to have a radical change of life because most the life is unbalanced. More they need a counter reaction to help them to start a new journey. Also, there is a quest and a problem with the idea of norms and values people are supposed to follow. You know, I will bring an example with the prison system, which is very interesting, I think, and which goes with this idea of rehabilitation in prison. But in this, before taking this example, I would like to speak about the current context that I propose to call crisis of civilization and confusions of morals, meaning that there is an ethical doubt in many societies, especially in non-religious societies, of course. So if you, again, if you speak about the West, but not only the West, you find that a lot of people feel a crisis of civilization because of the lack of a leading model. They don't know what they live for. They don't know what's the quest for. I mean, they don't know what's the meaning of life. Things are being shaken more and more, and the value systems politics try to promote and society tries to promote is very weak. And the fact that this value system is weak, it makes difficult to convince people to follow this value system. I will speak about that right now. For instance, in prison or other marginalized environments, like for instance, if you talk with the homeless people, or if you go to drug addictions shelters, or, you know, this kind of marginalized environment, there are many doubts about the values of society. What's good, what's bad, what's correct, what's wrong. People are confused about that. Thus, they struggle to feel responsible for their crimes or sins. And many have no real desire to change. It's a paradox because, on the one hand, they want to change to feel better, but on the other hand, they think something is wrong in society. So they say, what's the point to adapt society? Or they would say, if the society is sick, it's normal to feel like outcast in this sick society, you know? That's the argument of many people who are in prison. I have a concrete example. I worked in a European prison a few years ago. There was a man from South America, Latin American guy who was quite old for being in prison. He was like 65, I think 65 years old, and he spoke about the reason. He spoke about the reason why. Sorry, I was reading the chat messages at the same time. So he spoke about the reason why he was acting like a criminal from his childhood. And it was very difficult to work with him. Why? Because he told me, I was a kid, I was 5 or 6 years old, I went to school, and my father was under drugs and under alcohol at home. It was very difficult to live in this situation, and I couldn't even buy a pen. So I went to school without pen and without sheet of papers. And in school, the teacher was upset with me. He said, "Oh, you come here, you don't even have a pen. Go back home." So that's the experience he has of life. A completely unfair experience. He said, we suffered from misery, poverty. We are rejected in school because we are poor. The family is totally mess. And then you see that the official people, like governmental people or elites of the country, they live a very luxurious life with many wastes, many high way of life. And this paradox made him think the life or society is unfair. So what's the point to be correct? What's the point to be straight in such a society? So if I rob, I'm not to blame. The people who are to blame are the people who are rich, whereas while we are dying, while we are suffering from poverty. You know, that's his experience, and all his life it was conducted criminal activity without any kinds of guilty feeling. When I told him, he was 65, like this. When I told him, what do you think about changing, maybe it's not the correct things that you did. I say, why is not correct? You think that this society is correct? Don't blame on me. Blame on the real responsible of the poverty. I'm just a poor guy. You know, that's what the argument. Very difficult to deal with it. Because also you will find the critic of a double standard of the West or of the system from these people. They would say, you ask me to be correct, but political are liars or things are corrupted. So why you blame poor people in the prison? Then also you will see a lack of sense of belonging to the community, what we call in sociology, anomie. Anomie meaning that people are living here, but they don't feel togetherness, they don't feel connection with the broader society. So it drives to selfishness. I do whatever it is to survive. And finally, you have this moral, ethical, and legal crisis in the system. You have this crisis in the system, which makes it very difficult to ask people to change their behavior, because if you ask them to change, they will say, what for? In the name of which ethics? In the name of which values we have to be straight? Whereas we live in a world with a lot of injustice. The problem here, you see that the Western society is sending ambiguous messages, because we can ask in the West now, what are the human values that are good? Who believes in them? You know, that's why I speak about the crisis of civilization these years. Because now people are confused. They say what's good, what's wrong, why? And it has to do from the passage or the shift from modernism a few decades ago, which has a lot of social inequalities and ethnic oppressions in the system, you know, with the Western colonies and so. But it shifted somehow to postmodernism, which deconstructs the old system without proposing alternatives. So now we found ourselves in a new way, in a new environment full of contradictions and confusions, which don't help people. When speaking about postmodernism, a lot of people will speak about nihilism, for which the word is devoid of all meanings and values. So if you think that way, it's very difficult to consider the quest for meaning, because there's no meaning in this assumption. Also, the idea of the deconstruction traditional reference points, such as body, are you a woman, a man, you know, the gender things, gender change, what's masculine, what's feminine, what's man, what's animal, because you have the anti-specism ideology also, and many other things show that the deconstruction, on one hand, it's good if you build something behind, but if you deconstruct and you let the field out of references, that's very violent for people, because they feel what I'm living for, what I'm supposed to do, and it drives to a lot of suffering. And you find that here, for instance, with teenagers, even with children who have a lot of questions that my generation didn't have. It drove to kind of a period of turmoil, loss of meaning, and rejection of religions and traditional civilization legacies. Deconstruction without reconstruction, I think that's the main issue, the main problem of that. Consequence can be feeling of emptiness, social enemy, instability, anxiety, despair. So that's, sorry to say, that's quite a negative portrait of what happened in different countries, in different societies. But if you understand the situation, which is the cultural civilization crisis we face in many countries, it's very difficult to speak about quest for meaning and faith, although you come with another system. That's where I'm coming now. So, talking about spiritual and faith-based approach to social work, it can be seen as a response to this chaos. It can be seen as a response to this imbalanced environment. And it's not totally new, of course. So quickly we can identify two kinds of counseling practice or social work approach that deal with religious or spiritual elements, to talk broadly. So when I speak about religious elements, spiritual elements, for instance, I refer to the idea that there is transcendental meaning in people's life, that there is a spiritual component, that there is other dimensions, that's the physical dimension. So there are two kinds of this approach. Some of these programs or approaches are based on specific religious denominations. For instance, you have a Christian-based social work with many denominations. You have a Jewish perspective of social work, whatever it is. You know, you have Islamic perspectives of social work, and so. But also, you have other projects which consider the spiritual dimension without being attached to a specific religion. For instance, there is like a nursery home for the healing of drug addicts, which propose an approach insisting on spiritual practice with the idea of thinking what's the meaning of life, and to try to see the responses of different religious traditions of current problems. So that's maybe interesting to reflect for the rest of our presentation here, that show that sometimes, even if we belong to a specific religious approach, we belong to a specific religious tradition, but at the same time, there are other projects that can give us inspiration of what can be done to help people to connect with the idea of quest for meaning, the idea of finding why they live for, the idea of God, and so. And then you can connect that with Islamic practice somehow. We'll speak about that in a few times, inshallah. So here, what we want to do is to integrate spirituality of religions in social work and counseling. For that, I think that we can speak about three different ways that we observe, or that we can not only observe, but that we can concept, because it's an ongoing project. So when talking about religions and social work, we can differentiate between these three approaches. The first one, the first model, means that people have to convert to the religion to change. That's very typical. Imagine you have I don't just speak about Islam. Imagine you're part of a church, Christian church, evangelical denomination, and you see a lot of problems around you in the neighborhood, and you see people suffering. You would tell them, oh, if you want to change your life, you have to come to the church, you have to convert and to start to follow the path. Same with Islam. We have a mosque, Islamic center in a ghetto place, and you see a lot of people suffering from drug addiction, alcohol, crime. You go out, you say to them, you want to change your life. Allah is calling you, come with us. Let's start practice Islam together. Let's start praying together. Then you will have important change in your life. You know, that's one way to deal with that. I don't say which way is correct, good, wrong. we can speak about that later on. But that's one way. I hope it's clear here. It's very important. So one way to advocate for social change is to convert people or to attract people to the faith. And you think if they follow the faith, that's the most important, because first the idea is the hereafter, but even for this life, you need to follow a proper way of life in which Islam gives you the tools you need to have a adequate way of life, for instance. But then you have another approach, which is the model according to which religion shines positively on the outside. The positive effects in terms of social change is not only exerted on the believer, but on all, I don't know why it's written stuff here, on all the people, not the staff, not all the people. So model B, just imagine you have an Islamic center in non-Muslim environments, but the good you do will have an impact on all the community, including non-Muslims. So that's another model. A, B, and C are not excluded models. You can combine both, but that's different ways to understand the role of Muslims. Model C, religion, Islam, for instance, provides a model of intervention that can be useful to all, regardless of religious affiliations. So that applies when we speak about Islamic medicine, when we speak about Islamic psychology, for instance. The idea is we take the teachings of the faith, we take the teachings of Islam, for instance, then you conceptualize a way to deal with human problems, and then you offer the model to everyone who is interested in it. Sometimes they are not Muslims, but they can benefit of that. That's the Maqasid approach. Mainly when we speak about Maqasid approach, we refer to the point C. Yeah. Coming back to A, because now I would like to develop, expound on A, B, C. Then we'll reach the conclusion in a few minutes. But I think ABC is very interesting and important. So when we speak about A, reasons that help explain, reasons that explain how religious conversion can enable someone to change their life. Imagine that you see many people suffer from many ailments, psychological issues, social problems, family problems, and when they convert to the religion, when they become Muslim, they begin to practice Islam, for instance, and their life is changing. It's a very powerful thing, but it implies da'wah. It implies to convince people of the validity of the faith. So that's one aspect of it. But when doing my research study in Colombia and Mexico, or in other countries as well, I could see a lot of people like totally change their life because they start to practice Islam. You know, they find a meaning in their life. They find a relation to Allah, what we call transcendental spirituality. They adopt a healthy lifestyle, far away from alcohol, far away from drugs, crime, and also they join a new community, a group. It's very important, and obviously it has effects in healing, in the quest of meaning, and in the life change. That's a very powerful way to change the life. But the problem, Allah yahdi liman yasha. We can't guide people. We just can spread the message and try to counsel people, to explain them what Islam is about, and so. But finally, we can't force people to convert. Obviously, we can't pursue them. So that's one thing which is interesting to consider, but that's not enough, I think. Then, in the case approach B, religion, Islam shining positively on the outside. It's very interesting because we have to develop this idea. I know it's done in quite a lot of settlements. You find that in a lot of cities, in the countries worldwide. You find Islamic centers, which are very active in the environment. They provide social welfare services. They feed the homeless. They organize sport activities for the youth. They give counseling sessions. They promote welfare in the neighborhood, and it's very powerful. And here you don't need to be Muslim to benefit from the presence of such an Islamic center. You can be non-Muslim, go there, and you take benefit. It helps you for your life, you know. Also, it's a powerful way of doing dawah. Also, that's a side effect here. So not only the congregation, practicing Muslims, people who go to the mosque benefit from it, but the wider community, included non-Muslims. And B, I think there is a needed effort to promote this approach of Islamic centers, because it exists, but not in all the places. Because often we insist on A, da'wah conversion, and we forgot B. Regarding C has been totally forgotten so far. It's about Islamic models for social work counseling. It's true that today, till today, over the last years, you will find so-called Islamic ways to do social work. You will find Islamic approaches. But often when you go through them, it remains superficial. Why? Because they are not based on a genuine framework founded on a holistic approach to the sacred texts, Quran and Sunnah. It's more like bricolage. So sometimes people taking elements and it's like they put the label Islam, but you don't feel why is it Islamic? What's so Islamic inside? You know, that's how we have to think about that carefully when trying to develop a Maqasid approach to social work or to whatever it is. So here, I think that it's interesting to consider 2 points at that level. First, we have to develop a reflection on the plural nature of man, which considers the spiritual dimension very carefully. That would be the main difference with the non-religious social work approach. We have to understand what's human according to Islam. What's the components of human? And here, if the human is Muslim or not Muslims, it doesn't change anything because it's a human. You know, one guy is a Muslim today, tomorrow is not Muslim anymore, and one other person today is maybe a kafir, tomorrow is a Muslim. We never know that. So we deal with humans, with this idea of how human work according to the teachings of the Islamic tradition. Secondly, it's very important for this exercise, for this task, to consider both holistic approach to Quran and Sunnah, as the Professor Jasser Auda teaches in his books, and also a teleological approach, which means an approach based on the Maqasid-based approach. We do things with an expecting result. Like many verses on the Quran, connect some action to expected results and impact. If we want good illustrations, I think that what we call Islamic psychology gives very interesting results so far. It's linked to, of course, what we call Islamization of knowledge, integration of knowledge. We don't have time to go back to the definitions now, but I'm writing here the references of a few papers. You can find more papers in the website islamic-psychology.org, for instance, and that gives you an idea, that gives us an idea of how we can develop Islamic perspectives in psychology, in social work, in politics, in whatever it is. That's for the practical example. But now I would like to come to my conclusion for the last 3 minutes. I would like to speak about not really communication models, but kind of, you know, how you convince people of the interest of that, because that's part of the exercise. Because if you propose a service, you have also to find people who are interested in the service in order to get an impact. A concern you will hear when talking about that in non-Muslim communities, for instance, they say, why should we develop Islamic perspectives in scholarship? They are very skeptical. They say, oh, why you speak about Islamic psychology? Psychology is psychology. The thing here is that they forget that every human knowledge is based on assumptions and what we can call worldviews. So Freud psychology, for instance, the psychology developed by Freud is based on a worldview which is totally materialistic and atheistic, which is problematic when dealing with the soul and so. If you look at Jung, you can find much more interesting aspects that you can interpret in the line of Islamic teachings, because Jung believed in the transcendental reality. He believed in the spiritual dimension, meaning he believed in the idea of God, although he wasn't Muslim. He was not Orthodox Christian neither. He was a Christian, but with a very, doubtful approach and so. But it's interesting to see that their works are based on a very different worldview. And Islam Islam implies also another worldview on which scholarship can be built. So just to respond naively to the question, I would say, why not applied Islamic-based science or principles to non-Muslims? Because it's about dealing with humans. Whereas atheist-based science apply on Muslims. Today, you go to any Muslim country worldwide, you have psychologists dealing with materialistic psychology, psychology that don't acknowledge the reality of God, that don't acknowledge the existence of God. And that's quite, that has to do with epistemology, that has to do with our understanding of human natures, which is based on philosophical assumptions. And now I think even in the West, we live in a period in which these talks can have voice, because we speak about the colonial approach to knowledge and to scholarship as well. Yes, let me, oh, what happened? Yeah, sorry, are you here? Are you hearing me? I'm still here.
We can hear you, yes.
Okay, I thought I was disconnected. Yeah. Okay, let's before I go to the conclusion, this is a model, for instance, of what is called an Islamic psycho-spiritual model of the soul, of the mind, of the human being. It's interesting. It gives an idea of the output of what we can do by thinking about Maqasid methodology applied to psychology, but also applied to social work. I don't have time to stay in this scheme, but I can send it to you. I mean, I can send the PowerPoint file later on. Now to go to the conclusion, I think to consider the building of Islamic model of social work. We don't have time now to speak in depth about the Maqasid methodology, and so, as I said, the idea was to broaden the scope and speak about other issues related to the topic. But that's a very quick example of how we can proceed. Going back to Revelation, Quran, Sunnah, we find that we have to reflect in a broader perspective before going to the details. So when speaking about social work, counseling, or whatever kind of therapy it is, we have to understand what's the principal knowledge on humans and life. What's human being, nature of humans, the soul, the heart, spiritual side, and so. Then we have ontological values like the sacredness of humans and life, of course, unicity of Allah, Tawheed, life purpose, what we live for, respect of differences, very important. All that, when we read the Quran, we can extract some Quranic ayat that gives us a direction. based on this Quranic ayah, we can frame a model. We can begin to understand what's a human, what's the purpose of the human. Again, it's not just for Muslims. It applies to humans. It's somehow, if we want to speak in secularized terms, to non-Muslims, for instance, we would say it's a philosophical system by itself that can apply to give solutions to anyone regarding of the belief answer. Then we have also the idea of the quest for harmony, understanding the roots of suffering, the purpose of suffering, why people suffer, why is there inequality, what we can do, what's human justice, what's divine justice. People are very confused about these notions and concepts today. So we need to think and elaborate on all these various aspects. That's just example, that's not complete here. Then healing, it involves also empirical approach, like I said in the introduction, when you know people, how they work, how they live their life. We have this storytelling approach, considering each person's journey, giving food for reflection in order to understand what can be the cause of change, what can be the cause of positive change of someone who changes life. Also, conversely, what's the obstruction to change, what prevent people to get healed, to feel better, to live a better life. And it implies things that we could both extract from the Islamic traditions, but also from the empirical research we try to carry on. Finally, another aspect is just an example how it could be applied to prevent violence and conflict. Here also we have an Islamic model to deal with violence, an Islamic model to deal with conflicts, which, for instance, we can take compassion, rahmah, as the key value, but at the same time to recognize violence as part of life, but with wisdom, limits, and control. Whereas some people, they speak to very violent people in prisons and so, and they want to deny that human beings are part of violence in itself. Whereas Islam acknowledges that, but with limits, with a direction, with an orientation. That's just quick examples that we need to discuss all together, I think. But the issue to consider when speaking about spirituality, religion, and social work, firstly, we have to understand that we are still living under the hegemony of atheist, materialistic, non-religious, or at least secular hegemonic ideologies worldwide, not only in the West, but when you go to a Muslim country, you also have this influence. And that's interesting to note when looking about psychological approach, social work approach, policy, politics, how we deal with the diversity of identities. All that is very influenced by external points of view and external worldviews. Also, this idea of cultural relativism, which can prevent the affirmation of a particular religious tradition. That's a question of perspective. Point two is very tricky because it depends where you talk. If you are invited in a French university to speak about that, you'll speak slightly a bit differently than when you speak it to a Muslim audience, because from us Muslims, we believe in we share a worldview. We share a worldview which is clear, and that's our assumption if we want to speak that way. But when we speak with people from other backgrounds, other belief systems, other philosophical assumptions, we have to understand how to deal with that. So what I would do myself is to present the Islamic perspective, for instance, as one that we propose. Of course, people chose their way of life and so, but cultural relativism, on the one hand, it fights any attempt to speak about the truth. On the other hand, it allows different kind of models to find a place in society. But the main problem, to finish with the conclusion, is a distrust against Islam, or religion, not only Islam, and rejection of proselytism. So even if you don't feel you're doing proselytism, even if you don't do it, you don't want to do it, when you speak about Islamic model of things, psychology, it's perceived out of the Islamic environments as prioritizing. It is perceived as a hegemonic project that want to impose things. And I think here we have to be aware of how people perceive and to find the good tone and appropriate way of communicating that, because it's not the point. As I showed in the ABC scheme, we have three main things to consider: the value and the utilization of Islam for social work purpose, if I can say like that. It's not a good way to say it. I'm sorry for the expression, but if you feel how Islam can drive to social change, human change, I think we have these ABC options to consider, and is not only based on da'wah, is not only based on conversions, is based on what Islam offers to people, including to non-Muslims. So finally, how to deal with people pertaining to different faith traditions or without faith traditions? I think the intention has to be clear every time. Everything starts with the niyyah, what we want when we talk about Islamic perspective. An idea that we found in Islam, obviously, is the rahmah, compassion for everybody on earth, for every living creature, even. So when we have this idea, the point is not that people convert to Islam, but the point is that Islam shines around. You have an Islamic center, it can help people even if they don't want to be Muslims. That's interesting to understand that and to make people understand this approach. Also, it would be possible sometimes to find a common ground, common religious, spiritual values and principles shared between different faiths. Sometimes it's something to be considered. It doesn't mean that Muslim compromise at all. It means that some values are shared and we can work in respect to develop these values for the interest of all. Thank you. I hope I think I was a bit longer than 45 minutes. I think I did about an hour or 55 minutes. Sorry for the time. And please raise your comments and questions. And jazakum Allah khair.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baptiste. Alhamdulillah. I think most of us didn't really notice how time has flown really, and it ended quickly. Of course, inshallah, let's hear some comments or questions from the audience. And if anybody wants to comment or ask a question, if you want to do it by yourself, with the mic, you can just raise your hand, and then you can ask a question. And before anyone do that, well, there were just a few things, I guess, here in the chat session. In the chat. So our brother Wazir is asking, can the Maqasid Institute plan an online training program to educate some Muslim social workers on using the Islamic methodology? Inshallah, hopefully we can do that. And in fact, we are planning on a research program to be working on human dignity for refugees and migrants here in Turkey, and so maybe as a part of that research program, we may be able to produce a training program, inshallah, like that. But even before that, maybe possible. Then the question was on. I have not heard you mention the influence of shaitan. So we are told in the Quran on numerous occasions that shaitan is our worst enemy. So I'll just leave it to others to, let's say, Dr. Baptiste, you can take it up, or some others, other questions. And of course, we have Dr. Basma here. Maybe if you have anything to comment.
I was just going to say maybe Dr. Baptiste can answer the shaitan one, and then I can have a comment.
Okay, Bismillah. Yeah, regarding shaitan, if you go to this slide, Islamic psycho-spiritual model of view, it's not mine, of course. You have the reference. I can send it. I can send the article to you, and so you have this development mostly in psychology or Islamic psychology. Even here in the scheme, you find the concept of shaitan, Satan, down, and how it influenced the self, the nafs, and so. Regarding social work, I didn't speak too much about that because I think that raising light, now I'm speaking about my experience, my own experience as a previous practitioner in social work. Raising light is more important for me than fighting the bad things, because if you try to fight the devil or devilish forces, whatever we call it, so shaitan, how you do that? But if you raise awareness, you raise your light, you try to follow principle of Islam, you apply principles of Islam in your life, the role of the shaitan in your life will decrease automatically. Also, with a lot of people who suffer from ailments, psychological or social disorders, if you talk too much about the shaitan, I think it can be a bit tricky and problematic for some, because they would say, oh, I'm not the guilty one, it's all about the shaitan. You know, you hear that sometimes. It's not me, it's the shaitan, so I'm not the responsible. And it implies to, that being said, it implies to develop Islamic reflection of what shaitan means, what it is, and how it infects people. Because Quran responds to that. You know, the claim that is not means shaitan is not something you can defend, but in the population you find a lot of people taking this argument. But I think it has been more developed in what we call Islamic perspectives of psychology.
Brother Wazir, could you, you raised your hand, please. Unmute yourself, please, unmute.
First of all, I believe in respect to shaitan, the social workers should be trained and let they understand the workings of shaitan dealing with the individual. So they will know what kind of specific thing to adopt and to advise along the way. And the second point I want to mention about non-proselytization. I remember in 2005 in Guyana here, we had a big flood. We call it the Great Flood. Over 50% of the population was underwater for a month. And about 3 or 4 feet of water in your house and everything. So where I'm living, I have to migrate and go live somewhere else until that period finished, because my kids were small. But what the Muslims did, they went out to assist people in the flood. You know, assisting them, talking to them nicely and what have you, providing food and relief for them, without doing dawah officially, like preaching. And believe you me, that before the month finished, about 40 people accept Shahada without inviting them. And Alhamdulillah, they are doing very well. So I believe that this approach can work. And also the approach of telling people about Allah, also part of the cure. But being in their presence, visiting them regularly, maybe 2 or 3 times a week we will visit there. We set up 4 kitchens. So they will cook food in one community and they will cook food and distribute it among themselves. And alhamdulillah, over 400 people used to benefit every day from that kitchen. And that was it. So I think we can share our experience together. And that is why I'm asking if we can get a training program. So social workers, people working with people, doing relief work and social work, they can be edified in the Islamic methodology, how you do this in our time, inshallah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Jazakallah khair. A very interesting experience, very interesting model. Indeed, I think, I don't know if we insisted enough on this point, but I think that's very crucial, important to consider when talking about dawah. Well, myself, when I speak about social work and dawah, often I speak it as 2 different things, 2 different work. Things that don't need to be mixed up. But that being said, of course, depends what we mean by dawah. It's good to speak about Allah to people, to try to spread the Islamic message. That's important. That's one thing. But that's not the complete undertaking of Muslims. So that's one thing. At the same time, you give the example of the flood, and we have plenty of examples like that where Muslims provide support to afflicted people. And normally, according to the Quran and Sunnah, they don't have to do that with the intention to do da'wah. That's another thing. But the side effect, if I can use this expression, would be the conversion of people, which is highly appreciated, you know? That's my point here, that I repeated 2 years ago in with the Maqasid Institute. I tried to differentiate between different works we have to do. There is a direct da'wah, of course, but there are a lot of things that we do for rahmah, for spreading rahmah to people, compassion, helping people. At the same time, it drives to, it's the best da'wah that we can do also, but it's not the only purpose of the activity. That's why here I tried to, in this slide, I tried to organize this idea, ABCD tree model, ABC tree model. You know, one aspect is that it's true to consider to some extent that conversion to Islam is solution. It's true, it's not wrong. But that's one part. There's another things to do. Some people will never be Muslim, we don't know. Still, we develop projects for helping them because it's Islam. That's another thing, which is very powerful. And as you said, when you do that, a lot of people will have an interest for Islam. Maybe they don't convert to Islam, but they have respect for Muslims, which is very important too when talking about relations. And C, developing an Islamic approach to problems, Islamic approach to drugs, Islamic model to social work, whatever it is, it's very neglected today. A few people are doing that, but I think that's a gift to humanity, which is very important. And at the same time, its side effect will be also da'wah, invitation to people to the greatness of Islam. Because when they see what Islam is about, they will have an interest. Depends how we Muslims practice Islam also. So I think it goes in line with what you said, Sheikh. Thank you.
Okay, Rizda Gabasova. You raised your hand.
Yes,
Yeah, please go ahead.
yeah.
Yes.
Assalamu alaikum. I study social work in Germany and volunteer in work with refugees. And I have a question. I suppose the situation is similar to Switzerland, that in Germany it is very few Islamic social organizations, and Islamic centers provide very few activities in this area. And most of social workers or Muslim social workers are working in government or in Christian organizations. And for example, for refugees get help mostly from very strong Christian organizations. And my question is, how do you think if social worker, so Muslim social worker works in such organization, can he as a single person perform his activities according to Maqasid and Sharia? Have you any experience with that? Thank you very much.
Jazakallah khair. Thanks a lot for the question. It's also quite complex. When I worked in Germany, I worked in Switzerland, France, also for talking about Europe. And I think we face similar problems when we are a social worker working for Christian organizations or statutory social service from the state. Meaning, I think we can do it, but it depends all the situations we face, because we can't push people beyond what they want. But there are two situations here. Sometimes you can work for the state, but your recipients are Muslims, and it happens a lot in Germany, in France, in Switzerland. So, for instance, you work in prison, you provide counseling sessions, and the person talking to you is a Muslim. I think here, what you say in the affairs, it's between you and the recipient. In terms of the official, expectations on you, there is a lot of paradox here. I wrote a paper on that, especially in France, and Swiss, French-speaking part of Switzerland. A paradox, why? Because on the one hand, they want you to speak about religion in order to tackle violent extremism. And they say, oh, it's good, you speak Arabic, you can speak with the Arabs. Oh, you are Muslim, you can speak with Muslims, because some of them are a bit extreme. So they expect that from you. On the other hand, they are very scared or opponent to the proselytism. So they tell you, don't speak about the religion. Don't speak about who you are. That's paradox from institutions. I think this is a political problems, deontological problems to be debated in social work. But practically, if I look at concrete situations, if I speak with Muslims and he wants to speak about Islam, of course I will speak about Islam. And for that, I will use a Maqasid approach. If it's about speaking with non-Muslim, it depends on him. If he says he's atheist, materialistic, it doesn't care of the quest for meaning, it thinks that life is meaningless, it thinks that everything is about pleasure, whatever it is, I don't think I will have a way to deal with him implementing Maqasid approach. But if he's open to the idea of quest of meaning and the idea of God, what we live for, what I should do, I can help him even without pushing him to Islam, even without asking him to be a Muslim. Because I can share my experience, I can share Islamic models, for instance, and he can benefit from that even if he's not Muslim. That's the idea of my scheme ABC, showing that there are different ways to integrate Islam to approach of the social work according to the context, according to the beneficiaries. So I think, yes, it's possible, but it depends, of course, of the context. And there is this political question with the institutions that has to be developed in Europe, hopefully within the next years. I think we really have to speak about that. Yes.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from Ainul Mardia here in chat. So, what is Maqasid? Is it a methodology? How different Maqasid with an existing methodologies? And because they still talk about ontology and epistemology, and so she also talked about the diagram from Abdul Rothman and that you present this this diagram is based on the Western methodology. So if you could take a look at the chat.
Yes, I want to share maybe the diagram again. Yeah, because okay, I get the question, but the end of the question, you said the diagram you from Abdul Rahman you present is based on Western methodology. I don't understand this part of the question because for me, let me share. For me, I don't see in what it's based on Western methodology. I don't understand how we can say that. Actually, what's important to consider when talking about Maqasid methodology or Islamic methodology, there's no such thing as a complete opposition between Islam and the West. Because Islam integrates knowledge wherever it comes from, as long as it complies with its guidelines, with its main principles. So in Islam, there are fundamentals that we want to discuss. We accept things, concept as truth, as revealed truth. But beyond that, if something is developed in another civilization, let's say, if it doesn't contradict with the principles of Islam, and if it makes sense in terms of knowledge, it's rational, it's understanding, we cannot call that non-Islamic. That's the track we have suffered from over the last decades, I think. Because Islam, if we want, has become a label. People speak about Islamic restaurant, Islamic thing, Islamic clothes, Islamic whatever, but you mean what is Islamic? What does it mean? And with the Maqasid approach, we're going back to the roots of what means to be Islamic. Islamic in this perspective means to be based on revelation, Quran and Sunnah, with you hand in hand. If it's complying with this revelation, it can be called Islamic. It's not because a Muslim do something that is Islamic. That's important to see. Then if I look to the diagram, I'm not a psychologist myself. I didn't draft that. I don't see in what is based on the Western epistemology or methodology. At least is not the positivist one. Is not postmodernist neither. So I don't see any trace or sign of Western methodology be inside. But if you can explain, maybe I don't know.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, because I'm sorry if I get it wrong, because when I saw this advertisement, it says like Maqasid. I thought we will discuss about like different type of methodology in research. So I'm expecting something else from the one that I learned now, because Maqasid is, when you say Maqasid is based on Islam methodology, so I'm curious, what is it? So when you present this method, this diagram, because I read his thesis, the methodology. I'm not talking about the result of the research, but I'm talking about the methodology. Okay, so the methodology that used by the author is based on like Western methodology. He used like grounded theory. So I'm curious where this discussion's going. Yeah, that's why I come up with these questions. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. I'm not sure to really understand what it means here by Western methodology. Because what would be Islamic methodology instead? This kind of theme, are you still here?
Yes, yes.
Oh, okay, if you can, please, what would be Islamic methodology and Western
I don't know, honestly. Honestly, I don't know about Islamic methodology. That's why I come to these sessions. But my understanding about like existing, like Western existing methodology, like from epistemology, ontology, you should build up your research based on this type of thinking. So I thought maybe there are something out there that might be different.
Yeah,
That's why I'm asking you, when you said Maqasid, is it a methodology? That's my my first question. Is it a methodology? So if it is yes, how different this methodology with the other methodology that exists today? That's basically my question.
Okay, I understand now. Thank you. Yeah. Yes. So let's speak about the Maqasid methodology. Maqasid methodology is a methodology based on the assumption that Allah revealed knowledge in the Quran, and that the Quran was undertaken, or who say that, implemented by the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the Sunnah is implementation of the Quran. So there is no contradiction. That's the assumption. So knowledge is based on that to an extent. At the same time, empirical knowledge is recognized as a valid knowledge in terms of Islam because it's the knowledge that we get from observation, but it doesn't have to contradict with revelation. Now, if we look at the scheme, I would say here we totally see that it's Islamic methodology and not Western methodology, because in the scheme, it's written Allah. So Allah in Western methodology doesn't acknowledge that there is a God. It's written about heart, qalb, body, and mind and spirit. So we speak about the ruh, spirit, nafs, self. All these categories and concepts come from Quran, explained in Sunnah also. So that's knowledge coming from revelation. So when looking at that, I would say it's properly Islamic methodology and not Western methodology. Because if it was Western methodology, they could not even speak about Allah and spirit and shaitan and so, because they would just speak about body and mind and have some debates about if the soul exists or not. Yes.
So if I can assume based on your explanation that it doesn't matter in what way people collect knowledge, so long it is fit with the Sunnah and Quran, it will be like Maqasid. We can call it Maqasid, is it?
Yes, yeah. Maqasid, one of the approach of Maqasid, the first approach is to consider what's the sources of knowledge. And the sources, the roots of knowledge, one of the main or the principal one is revelation, Quran and Sunnah. And then Maqasid is an approach to go to the Quran and Sunnah in order to extract the guidelines, principles, to understand what Quran and Sunnah teaches. With that being said, of course, we integrate knowledge coming from outside, meaning from empirical observations and so on. That's another level.
Okay, I think we need more session on Maqasid. Thank you.
Welcome.
Well, I would, Sister Ainul Mardi, I would really encourage you to join our Maqasid methodology course that we run. We run it 3 times a year. Inshallah, we just completed our second cohort, and some of the participants here they have completed they underwent this Maqasid methodology course. So it's a kind of it is based on the work of Dr. Jasser Oda and on his latest book. And if you'd like to know more about the methodology, so you can just go to our website, and when we announce our next cohort, you can join us, and inshallah you can go through the whole course.
Sure. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so well, we have some here in the chat. We have some some comments. Okay, so our sister Yusra writes that Dr. Abdullah Rothman combines the Western approach and Al-Ghazali approach to ilm al-nafs. In his model, he acknowledges that the statement of wisdom is the lost property of the believer, and whenever he finds it, then he is more deserving of it. So thank you for that comment, Sister Yusra. And so we have a question from Fatima. You can, a comment rather. Yeah, a comment and a suggestion where you can find a video, I think, of Dr. Rothman. So there's a video link. Hafiz Khan is writing, we're in Trinidad are expecting the return of some women and children detained in Syria. If anyone have any experience dealing with it, dealing with similar situations, I would appreciate if you can contact me. So so HK at officerus.com. So and there's a WhatsApp number. So if you have any way, any experience dealing with returning women from women and children from Syria, so you can contact him, I guess. Okay, there's a question from Khadija Sundai. Assalamu alaikum. A possible way to introduce Islamic concepts would be to develop neutral terminology to make it more acceptable to those who have an aversion to religion. So maybe Dr. Baptiste, you could comment on that.
Yeah, again, I think that, thanks for the question. I think that has to be thought according to the context, because that's why I referred to interfaith projects also. Because, for instance, if you work with Christians, you have common backgrounds to some extent, of course, not completely, but you still have this belief in God, you have the belief of the hereafter, you have the belief of the soul, spiritual component of the body. So if you speak with them, you can agree on principles that are shared to develop some ideas, I think. But depends. If you speak to totally materialistic people, they will most likely reject your thing. And to make them scientifically valid, you need to be clear about the assumption. And you need to say, okay, the roots of our knowledge is grounded in Islamic revelation, and so I think that's needed to be correct at the same time, to be both precise and, you know, to acknowledge when we come from. And then for communication, it depends a lot of the context. If I would do a project with the Christians, I would find common values we have and insist on that, and forget the differences for the project, because the differences are not relevant to help people, for instance. But if I speak about, if I speak to a Muslim audience, then I can go deeper in the Quran and Sunnah. So it depends a lot on the context. But that being said, it's a problem of honesty. A lot of so-called Western approach to knowledge claim to be neutral, universal, which is not the case. And they made us forget that even within Western scholarship, there are differences. Even in psychology, you take Freud and Jung, it's totally different, because Freud always thought about unconscious. He spoke about the spiritual dimension and the hereafter and so, but he's still a Western psychologist. So it depends with who you work. But let's be clear about our assumption, and let's ask other people to be clear on their assumption, because a lot of knowledge that has been developed in the Western academia was based on the assumption that there is nothing upon the physical or the material, which is an assumption. If they don't speak about, if they don't acknowledge the assumption, it makes look like their science is universal and valid for everybody, which is not the case. It's just a theory. It's just an assumption, as we have our assumption. So we always have to play, not to play, but to find what's the common ground. Where are the people talking when they speak with the authority? Is always the problem with normative discourse. A lot of people have a normative discourse, but they refuse religious people to have a normative discourse. So a way to deal with them is to say, okay, you also have to acknowledge your own normativity, your own philosophical assumption. When you acknowledge that, then we can speak. But you cannot claim to have the universal truth, as is not the case, you know. So it's about understanding the perspective of the others and adapt our communication based on the profile and identities and beliefs and proponents without compromising our system.
Okay. Anyone else wants to ask a question or make a comment? There were some comments here. Okay. Oh, some are so lengthy. Pop it out. Yeah, there is a comment from Brother Taibi. So if we proceed from the example of the prophets, so we find that God told us about the Prophet Saleh. As for Thamud, we guided them. And Saleh had ordered them to let the camel drink from the river, but they killed her. So, okay. And the lecture referred to a prisoner of speech, and the state is the oppressor, not us. So a model of society that does not corrupt must be found, weaving its threads with all people so that they do not corrupt the earth. And it has a parallel advocacy activity. And as the lecturer said, God is the guide, but the evils of people have an impact on all members of society. And this is what we must cooperate and keep telling. Yeah, thank you for that comment. Anything else? Dr. Baptiste, do you see any comment or question do you want to address in the chat?
Yeah, maybe the two last comments are about prison, and I think that's interesting environment to reflect on, because people face big amount of suffering, not only prisoners actually, but that's places where you find human, disillusions and suffering. And the idea is widespread, yes, that the state is the oppressor, and that gives people somehow legitimacy to do whatever they want. They say, I rob the bank, but it's not to rob because the bank are the real robbers. The things you will hear a lot. And actually, the only way to respond to that is to have a belief system. If you don't have belief system, if you think about logically, what do you say? You say, okay, actually it's right. But if you have a belief system, you think, I follow a way, which is the Islamic way, for instance, and in that way, we can't legitimate to harm people who harm ourselves. So even if somebody harm me, it doesn't mean that I can punch him. It's not like that. If an institution robs people, it doesn't legitimate me to robbing the institution. But as long as the person is not sensible to these discourses, it's difficult to work with them. That's why I spoke about the need to be clear about ethics, values. And in all civilizations, I think we can say that historically ethics and values came from religions. And now that we have this reject of religions, it's difficult. That's why there is this crisis in the West and beyond, in which what are values, what's good, what's bad. People are confused about that. And the last question, yeah, people in prison again. The problem, we say, okay, they reoffend because nobody helps them when they go out of prison. I think the problem is bigger than that. And we have a responsibility to tackle these problems, and very few people do this. It's like the alcohol addict would say, alcohol is the problem of my life. Actually, the problem of his life is not alcohol, is the cause which push him to be into alcohol. If somebody is drug addict, why did it begin to take drugs? Often it's because there was a suffering. And often the suffering is linked to the quest of meaning, because everybody lives tragedy. And a lot of people, they may live tragedies, they don't get the meaning in it. They say, okay, my wife died, my brother died, and I was there, and whatever happens, I'm miserable. I don't know why life is so harsh. You know, that's the reality of a lot of people. If you don't have any system, any knowledge, any explanation of that, it's difficult because the person just feels is unhelped, and that the person is under trouble without any understanding of the meaning of what he faces. So that's why bringing back knowledge, because religion is knowledge, bringing back elements to help him understanding his life, understanding what's the life. Everybody is going to die. If you ask this anthropological question to most people, they cannot deal with that. You know, if you think about death, if you are not a believer, it's very difficult. You say, okay, what's the point then if we die? But sometimes, especially people who suffer a lot, they need to go back to fundamental questions of the life. And here, religion has a message to convey, which would eventually help them, because we just propose, we just spread the message. The one who want, they follow. The one who don't like them, of course, they are free to dislike it. They are free to reject the message. So I think that when talking about social problems, so psychological problems, it's important to go in depth to be efficient, because if we just think that drugs is the problem, actually is not the problem. Drugs was the solution for the people to taking drugs. They think, I'm suffering, I take drugs to get better. Obviously, they're getting worse after taking drugs, but the problem was not drug in itself. It was, I think, linked to existential questions and lack of meaning in life and lack of references and ethical model. And that's also a contribution we would like to develop, I think.
One quick question and maybe comments. You know, I think we have to differentiate here, and I think there was one comments regarding that. It's about the methods. You know, there are research methods, and then there is methodology. There's Maqasid methodology. So in this approach on the methodology or the worldview, we do accept some of the research methods, you know, as a qualitative method. So Dr. Baptiste, you can also comment on that, because you went and you studied those societies, those communities, like in depth. I mean, you went and you interviewed them, you worked with them. And these are the some of these research methods. They are legitimate methods. And, you know, we don't have to call them like it's a Western method or, you know, Islamic method. They maybe to some of them could be universal. I mean, talking to people and observing is a universal kind of method and approach. But the worldview and the methodology is different. And so this is where I think maybe it's good to see the difference a little bit here. The methodology and the methods that people employ, because I think one of the comments was that Dr. Rothman used what is that? What kind of approach was there? From the grounded approach, yeah. So it's a method. So Dr. Baptiste, please.
Yeah, I think the question is twofold. The approach, Maqasid approach, on the one hand, you have these methodology based on revelation, but on the other hand, you need to assess reality, to understand reality. And the question here focuses on this second part. The fact that we want to assess reality involves empirical approach, which is neutral somehow, because the idea is what happens, is not what I want. We have to distinguish between two. Normative is what we want to apply, but descriptive, analytical, first of it, is to understand what happens in society. What happens in society, we can be objective and neutral here to some extent, because it's not what I want, it's what happens today. So I just go out, if I want to simplify, I observe reality, I take notes, and try to develop knowledge of that, And in this aspect, we are into sociology or empirical research, which is not Western-based methods, I would say, because it's not based on assumptions. It's based on methods, way of doing things in order to get knowledge, descriptive knowledge of a reality. It's like going to the outside and thinking, what's the temperature today? Or it's like going to a country and see which are the groups of people, how are they living, what time are they sleeping, and so, it's still neutral knowledge, because if people sleep at 8 and you see that and you report they sleep at 8, it's not about your worldview, it's something you report. And that is integrated in the Maqasid approach. And that's how we deal with it from two perspectives, which are not antagonistic, they are not a contradiction. That's two ways to do the things. For instance, if I would think about social work and so, on the one hand, you reflect on the revelation, scriptures, what Islam teach you about doing social work. In the other hand, you observe people's problem. Why are they drinking alcohol or taking drugs, for instance? For this second question, you don't need to have any religious assumption. You just go to the field and you apply methods developed by social sciences, and they are valid to collect accurate data that you can proceed. And at the late stage, then you go back to the revelation knowledge or the principles of Islam to try to find a solution. That's two perspectives which are not opposite at all. I tried to summarize very quickly, but that's what they teach in the Maqasid programs that we give online also to have more details.
Dr. Masma, if you'd like to address, just some of this, the comment that you made, Dr. Basma.
Assalamu alaikum. I'll be brief because Dr. Baptiste, mashallah, has been taking care of all of the questions brilliantly. I was just on this particular point, I was saying that this is a technique that we see in the Quran. The Quran actually does talk about what happened, simply telling us this is what happened, these were the results, this is what ought to have been. So it does combine, as Dr. Baptiste is saying, there's no contradiction between the different approaches. It's just how and when we do it and we incorporate it. But these methods are themselves explained in the Quran, which is quite interesting. I think I really enjoyed this morning's talk, and I'll be very interested to see how it develops, because, and I agree with Dr. Baptiste, I don't think there is such a thing necessarily as an Islamic science or an Islamic psychology. I think there's a truth. There's a truth that anybody can get at. And when you read Jungian psychology, for instance, you're going to notice some things that he says that will blow your mind. I mean, they seem very Islamic. He was not a Muslim, but one of the things, for instance, that he says is that we can never fully know the self, because if we knew the self, we would know everything. And if you read the Quran, you'll realize the ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us he will show us his ayat in the horizon and in ourselves, which literally means that you can never fully get to know what is on the inside. You can explore it just like you can explore the universe, but you will get a little small glimpse of what it is. We also, if we look at Donald Winnicott, his idea of the true self and the false self, of course, we don't have this in Islam, but we do have that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created us with the best reinforcements or in the best form. And then we brought the human to the lowest of the low. So we're also looking at this spectrum. There's nothing false about the human being in the way we think about it, but there are two polar opposites. There's ahsan taqweem, the best of what we can be, and there's asfala safilin, which is the profane, the mundane, the worldly. And so how do we envision that? So it's going to be very exciting in the future to see Dr. Baptiste's research develop and to see how he's going to bring these concepts in so we can better understand, you know, this human creation, what exactly we are. You know, what does it mean when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says we are insan and we are bani adam and we are mar and we are nafs and we are, you know, rijal wa nisa, and what does this bring to our wealth of knowledge of what it is to be human and what it is to have these tragedies in our lives and how we can deal with them. So I'm really looking forward to that, and thank you very much for an amazing presentation this morning.
Thanks a lot. Jazakallah khair, Dr. Basta.
So, okay, thank you very much, everyone. I guess we can end our session today. Wherever you are, thank you very much for joining, and you know, your interest, your comments, your questions. Alhamdulillah, it means you're really interested in the topic, and it's something bothers you. Let it bother you, and you know, it means that we need to find some questions. We have questions. We want to find solutions, and we want to understand things in the universe, in our lives, in our societies. And alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guides us through the book of Allah, through the prophets, and through the scholars who give us their understanding of these issues and challenges. So alhamdulillah, thank you very much, everyone, and all the best, and we hope to see you in our upcoming sessions, inshallah. I think next one will be after Ramadan, so we'll announce that additionally. So thank you again. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you, Dr. Baptiste. Thank you very much. Thank you.